some water.
Perfect. We still got 3 minutes.
Okay, maybe I'll run real quick then. I'll be right back.
Okay. Hello. Okay, I've been talking and not realizing that no one but Shilyh could hear me. So, very good. Hello, all. Welcome to the third live stream during our ongoing pandemic lockdown of the Dallas-Fort Worth Experimental Film Society. I'm joined by Dr. Shilyh Warren, who is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Dallas. She is going to be helping me introduce our screening tonight of 2 films by Strand. I'm really excited to be able to be presenting this program, and I really appreciate you, Shilyh, for being with us to present this. So let me first just begin by saying a few thank yous. In addition to thank you, Shilyh, I also want to thank my collaborators, Lily Taylor of Top 10 Records, Barack Epstein of the Texas Theater, and Oak Cliff Film Festival, as well as Jeremy Spracklin, who is at Spracklin Film and Video, as well as the G. William Jones Film and Video Collection at Southern Methodist University, and Scott Martin, who is also part of the Film Archive. They have been collaborators of ours since we began this project in late last year in 2019, if anyone can remember 2019. So just thank you all for helping us present this program. Oh, I should also say a quick thanks to Canyon Cinema, who have provided the films for tonight. And Chick Strand had a particular close association with Canyon Cinema, being one of the founders. Oh, I'm hearing that I'm getting a bad echo. I'm not sure where that's coming from because I made the point to use headphones tonight. I'll see if I can figure out why that's happening. I apologize for those of you who are hearing audio issues. Oh, it's all right now, evidently. And it looks like I lost Shilyh, so I will try to get her back here in a moment. Let's see. Gosh, okay, so we're starting with a lot of technical issues. Okay, sorry about that. So I will get Shilyh back here in a moment, and tonight we're presenting the work of Chick Strand, who is a filmmaker who had for most of her career was based on the West Coast. As I mentioned briefly, she was involved in the very beginning of a series of screenings along with Bruce Bailey that ultimately became Canyon Cinema and the San Francisco Cinematheque. And Canyon Cinema was kind enough to lend the films for tonight, which will be live streaming tonight on YouTube, and also will be available through video on demand with a link that should be in the description of this video or in the Facebook event. Chick Strand began her filmmaking career when she was organizing these early screenings that were part of what became Canyon Cinema's programming, and was actually taught filmmaking by Bruce Bailey. Bruce Bailey, coincidentally, just passed away in April of this year, which is something that's certainly been felt throughout the Bay Area film community where he was based. Oh, I should also mention, initially it was planned that this event would be held as a screening of 16mm films. Most of Strand's work has only been available in 16mm, and bringing it to Dallas might have been one of the rare occasions in which her film had been shown here. But because of the ongoing lockdown, unfortunately we weren't able to do that. But Canyon was nice enough to provide these very nice digital transfers. So a little bit more about Chick Strand. She made her first film at 34 after working with Bruce Bailey. She was a student of anthropology in Berkeley, and then in 1966, which was several years after she and Bailey had been organizing these screenings together, she relocated to Los Angeles and studied ethnography at UCLA. Both of those sort of educational backgrounds will be very important to the films we see, because Strand's work is at that really interesting intersection between documentary and experimental film that in many ways feels very contemporary to other things that are happening in film today, particularly in the experimental film world, where various experiments with ethnography have happened in many people's film practices. After receiving that education, she taught for 24 years at Occidental College, which was one of the ways she supported her work. And in addition to working in California and making films in what we might think of as a more traditionally experimental, if that, it's an oxymoron, I know, but things we understand to be experimental film, which include things like collage film and experiments in printing and in processing. She also did these really interesting experiments with documentary, and a lot of that involved traveling to various areas in Mexico and Venezuela, where she worked with significantly with indigenous populations, and did some very interesting work in creating what I think, Shilyh will speak more to this, but a sort of subjective form of what we might think of as ethnographic filmmaking. The films we're showing tonight are a title called Soft Fiction, which is a work from 1979. It's a work she made in California, primarily with other women artists and filmmakers, and another film called COSAS de mi vida, which is one of a handful of films with that works with a particular indigenous man that she befriended named Anselmo. She made, I believe, 3 films. There may have been more than that. I might be wrong, but at least 3 films with Anselmo, which include Cosas de mi vida, another film called Anselmo, and one called Anselmo and the Women. And they were made over many years of their friendship together. So they come from a very sort of rich set of experiences. To give you a little bit of a personal anecdote about how I came upon Strand's work, I actually saw Soft Fiction and another film called Kristallnacht in 2009, maybe a couple months after she passed away. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see any of her films while she was living and never got to see her present her work in person. But when I was in Chicago, there was a sort of tribute screening for her with prints of both of those films. I should also say Soft Fiction was recently restored by the Academy Film Archives, and the version that we're showing tonight is scanned from those new prints that were made as part of that restoration. I also first encountered Cosas de mi vida at the Dallas Museum of Art, which was installed on a loop as part of the great moving image exhibition called Truth 24 Frames Per Second, which was really great. It also included films by Bruce Conner and Ben Rivers and a handful of other folks, Shirin Nishat, Ant Farm, great survey. And they actually showed it on 16mm film, which was great. That was part of why I was there, was to get the looper to work, which I never succeeded in doing. But nonetheless, I got to see the film like 30 times, which was really great. So, but the digital version we're showing tonight is also very nice. So to help us introduce Chick Strand and her work, and also will be present for a question and answer over YouTube's chat later, is Dr. Shilyh Warren, who is a scholar of film and film theory at the School of Arts and Humanities in the University of Texas at Dallas. She specializes in film history and theory, feminist studies, documentary, women's cinema, and experimental cinema and eco-cinema. I want to talk to you more about that. And is the author of her first book, Subject to Reality, which I have a copy of here, which also has this fantastic stripe, which looks just like my parents' house from the 80s. We had that exact color scheme in our living room, and I love it, which is a book on women and documentary film, particularly focusing on the 20s through the 40s and the 1970s. So please do check that out. And in fact, not to cut into Shilyh's introduction, but we're going to be, Shilyh has been kind enough to donate 5 copies of this book, which we will be selling and then donating the proceeds to a local social justice cause. And we hope you guys will contact us about that. If you're interested in purchasing one of those books, please send an email to info@top10records.org. I'll mention that again later if anyone missed it, but info@top10records.org if you want to purchase this book. We'll be donating the proceeds to a social justice organization here in Dallas. Okay, so just a little bit more. Shilyh, of course, teaches at University of Texas at Dallas. I thankfully was able to teach alongside her there for a time. She kindly brought me in to teach a few classes. Her focus is on, the history of women's documentary filmmaking, and she's published in many other areas, for instance, Signs, Camera Obscura, the South Atlantic Quarterly. She holds a PhD in literature and a certificate in feminist studies from Duke University and an MA in comparative literature from Dartmouth College. So I've been talking too long. I'll now hand it over to Shilyh, who I'm really thankful is going to help me introduce this program. So thanks, Shilyh.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that nice introduction. And I just want to take one moment to think about the ways that, Michael, you two are part, in my mind, of Chick Strand's legacy. Like Strand, in his own work, Michael focuses on materiality, on the
Oh,
experiential and the experimental, on emotive cinema that makes you feel differently for moments of time that are feel maybe stolen or gifted from the treadmill of everyday life. Not only that, Michael too has a passion for collective viewing experiences like this one. He doesn't just make gorgeous and thought-provoking work; he creates space and time in the world for the work of others. Strand and her friends and lovers lured people to experimental film by creating comprehensive experiences, costumes, door prizes, pies, apparently. We have to make do with Zoom and YouTube and social distancing for now, but all the same, here we are, brought together by cinema. Thank you, Michael, for getting us at least this close to the smoky haze of California in the 1960s, not just tonight, but for so many years and years and years here in Dallas. Thank you, Michael. Um, I want to take just a few more minutes to introduce the films for tonight, Soft Fiction and Cosas de mi Vida. Strand's filmmaking is often described, as Michael said, as experimental ethnography. What do we mean by that? How do these terms relate to each other? And what about Strand's work has made her so consistently relevant since she started making her films in the 1960s and 70s? The history of women in documentary, turns out, is deeply entwined with the history of ethnographic filmmaking, which, as you can tell, is part of my work and my book. In fact, if we try to pinpoint the first documentary maker, we would end up talking about a very curious and problematic person by the name of Osa Johnson, who made entertainment films about alleged cannibals in Papua New Guinea in the 19 teens and 20s. Like Robert Flaherty and his wife Frances, Osa and her husband Martin built their careers on films about natives, others, the exotic, savage, noble, different. We would also have to mention the work of Zora Neale Hurston, an African-American woman you maybe know best for her literature. She was also trained as an anthropologist and took her camera to the rural South in the late 1920s to document African-Americans at work, at leisure, and prayer. Women like Margaret Mead would come into the picture later. All of these women, whom I consider the pioneers of documentary filmmaking, were also pioneers of ethnographic filmmaking. Women, it turns out, have been long interested in exploring the relationship between you and me, them and us, you and them. What makes us different from one another? Is it language, culture, race? What makes us similar and human, and how do we relate to each other? Strand's take on these questions has always been really unique. She brings the experimental to ethnography and thus kind of unravels its desires and shows us what we look for when we watch experimental films and, and what we desire from them. What can you really know about another person through cinema? And what can this knowing tell you about yourself, your own world? Why do you want to know? What will you do with the knowing? Here's what she had to say about traditional ethnographic film. She said, in most cases, ethnographic films, the people are presented in groups, um, acting out a ritual as a mass, faceless, nameless, all the same, all appearing to act and react in the same manner. Rarely are their own words used, even in translation. An uncaring and uninvolved voice of a narrator tells us what's going on. The films are like textbooks and not true films. Excuse me, not true film documents of a people. Right? And this was the tradition she was resisting in her work and what she was kind of really upending and redoing in her own kind of experimental ethnographies. The two films we'll watch for tonight are indeed true film documents about people. Both films are also about how people survive, how we endure life's terrible challenges and emerge transformed and yet integral to one another. In her own way, Strand was incredibly optimistic, finding unlikely beauty and revelation, even in traumatic and difficult stories. In Soft Fiction, just think for a moment about that title for a documentary, we meet 5 women who candidly reveal sensual and sexual experiences directly to Strand's camera. In 1979, this maybe would have been familiar for feminist circles and activists. And yet here, right, we break new ground really in ethnographic filmmaking. These are Strand's own friends and friends of friends, not exotic people far away. Yet these stories too have cultural value. And I think watching them, you'll notice right away how the language and emphases in the stories is very much of a certain time and place. There are moments in this film, especially Soft Fiction, that are difficult to hear. And I want to warn the audience tonight that the stories will be sexually explicit. And in one case, at about 20 minutes into soft fiction, we're presented with a difficult story about surviving childhood sexual abuse. Please take care if this is a sensitive topic for you. Yet Strand's goal in soft fiction is to explore female sexuality in all of its hyperbolic complexity and reality. These are real stories about real women, a far cry from the made-up worlds of Hollywood, which would have been right outside of Strand's door. The second film, Cosas de mi Vida, will seem to be on more stable ethnographic ground. This time our subject is an indigenous man in Mexico, a musician named Anselmo, who she came to know over years and years. Strand was passionate about Mexico and Latin America, as Michael said, and she made several films there, including one of my very favorites, Fake Fruit Factory from 1986, and I recommend that one as well. She started Cosas de mi Vida in 1965 and worked on it for 10 years. And she followed Anselmo through all of those years, capturing his life as it evolved and changed. But pay attention to the voiceover in this film. Who's speaking? What language? Why? Strand's films play at the intersection of so many opposing terms: pleasure and danger, fiction, nonfiction, experiment and tradition. It's as if she loves to challenge us and our expectations. Notice how often the films will shift from intensely serious to suddenly playful, from studious talking heads to dances of shadow and light. To quote Strand again, ethnographic films can and should be works of art, symphonies about the fabric of a people, celebrations of the tenacity and uniqueness of the human spirit. So let yourself enjoy these works of art, these symphonies. Let yourself be taking on the strange ride that only Strand can create.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shilyh. That was fantastic. So we will be back at the end of the screening. It's about a 120-minute program, and we'll be continuing on YouTube Live, Shilyh and I, to take any questions and to have a little bit of a conversation about what we see over the next hour and some minutes. So thank you again, Shilyh. That was fantastic. Thank you all for tuning in, and with that, we're going to switch to soft fiction and then Cosas de mi Vida. Thank you. Okay, and we're back. Thanks everyone for joining us for those amazing films by Chick Strand. There is a little bit of a delay. We're going to try to take some questions from you guys in the chat, but it may take me a moment to actually address it. So if you don't hear your question being addressed, just wait a moment. So, okay, Shilyh, so are you frozen there? Uh-oh. I think Shilyh is frozen. 1 second. We're going to get her back on in just a moment. But if anyone is just tuning in, I'm just going to text Shilyh and let her know she's frozen. Okay, so what's funny is by the time you guys know that we're frozen, it'll have already been like a minute of Shilyh being frozen. So anyway, thank you all for tuning in. If any of you guys came in a little late, these were 2 films by Chick Strand, Soft Fiction and Cosas de mi Vida. While we're waiting on Shilyh to come back, I am happy to take a question from anyone in the chat. But while I'm waiting on that, maybe I'll just tell a little bit of what I know of these films. Soft Fiction, of course, was the first film of Chick Strand's that I had the opportunity to see. And I saw it at the Gene Siskel Film Center in Chicago, part of a series called Conversations at the Edge. And when I saw Soft Fiction, it was one of the, at that moment in time, I think I would have decided it was my favorite film that I'd seen. And in many cases, I'd still say that that's the case, because it has this fantastic sort of combination of being a very intimate film, a very poetic film, and one that also mixes documentary style and maybe what we would say kind of factual things along with those kind of poetic gestures. So I believe it's correct to say that Chick Strand found a big influence in fellow Bay Area filmmaker Bruce Conner. And rewatching this film, I think you can see that there's a kind of collage aesthetic similar to Conner's films, like, say, A Movie or, Valse Triste, some of those other fantastic films. I think she's working in much the same way, but with footage that she herself shot, but is still juxtaposing images in a way that you might with, images that you were appropriating from other sources. One of my favorite moments is, I think it's after the story about heroin, where she cuts straight to the shot of the dog on the chair, which becomes this kind of is missing a leg. It becomes this kind of interesting opportunity to read that poetically rather than literally, and I think that a great deal of the film works on that basis. So Shilyh is back. Shilyh, I wanted to no problem. That's technology is our enemy tonight. So we are going to take some questions from the chat, but maybe we could just start by discussing some of what we saw there. So maybe to start off, because we sort of talked about these films, working at that intersection between experimental film and documentary, I wonder if, oh, are you frozen again, Shilyh? Uh-oh. It's a little bit of a comedy of errors tonight. Do we have any questions from the chat? I can riff for a while, of course, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any folks. I can see there's still about 21 folks viewing. So do feel free to ask a question. I should say one more time, we are selling copies of Shilyh's book, Subject to Reality. Let me get my thing off of the title there. Women in Documentary Film, which is a book that has just recently come out. And we're selling 5 copies of those that Shilyh has donated, and we're going to be donating the proceeds from that to a local social justice organization. So Lily, I believe, posted in the chat a link to the email for that if you guys are... Okay, so I have one question. Do you know who did the music in Soft Fiction? I have to admit that I don't. I'm not familiar exactly with what who she was working with. That might be something we could do a little bit of research on. I'm sure that she probably had other Bay Area collaborators that she would have been working with. So I think I saw some folks from the Bay Area in the chat, actually. I think I saw Scott Stark there. He may have the answer to that. Okay, so there's another question. Let's see, and I think is this Carolyn? I'd be glad for info about her process, selecting audio to go with the image or development of her scripts. Oh, looks like I have to let Shilyh back in. There we go. And Bart's asking, how do I get to the chat? It's on the YouTube. Hi, Shilyh, you're back.
I mean, my technology works great unless it's my turn to speak.
I know, yeah, we had you. Okay, so I'll just jump back into my question for you, which was, let's talk about that intersection that this rides between documentary and experimental film.
Documentary and experimental film?
Yes.
I mean, a tradition that goes all the way back to Vertov, right? So, like, not exactly happening for the first time here in Chick Strand's work in the 70s, and yet, I mean, it seems to me like the maybe even, and we see that in a lot of the Kenyan filmmakers, actually, right? A lot of really drawing from real life, and that in that kind of Vertov tradition, to kind of like see it again and see it newly, and to retrain our vision and our sense of being in the world through these juxtapositions, and as so many people pointed out, the sound image relations, right? Which is like, the collision between the form and the everyday, I think really gives us, the world, but again, anew, and how, and really makes us, I think, question, or let's say, re-question or ask questions about gosh, not just aesthetics and politics, I think, which is one way people think of it, but really like sort of like, being an art, maybe,
Mm,
like what does it mean? What is this world? What do we look at? What do we take from it? And how do we find ourselves in it? I think, that's what I feel like is, that sort of central experience of being in the world, being a part of this
mhm.
world, I think comes through so beautifully in her work.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's good that you sort of like mentioned that Vertov, all the way at that very seminal moment, was already writing that line in a really important way. And I know Vertov was one of, I believe he was the filmmaker that coined the term. Well, I think in Russian it would have been Kino Pravda, but when it got back to Europe, was translated as Cinema Verite. And
Right.
is what would Strand's relationship to a movement like cinema verite be? Because she was making these films through the 60s and 70s. I think maybe the 70s is when she took that more ethnographic turn, let's say. But it's hard not to see someone like Jean Rouche's filmmaking when we see a film like COSAS de mi vida in particular. What would do you see a relationship there that we can talk about?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought of it before, but those would be two, really, you strands in tension, right? The American strand of verite, which was about non-manipulation,
Hmm.
non-intervention, presenting what was filmed in front of the camera, supposedly, right? And then, of course, there was all the work in the editing to create the tension and the narrative and the suspense, that they downplayed in favor of like, but we showed you the world. You were there with the world, with us. Um, and then the Rouge tradition, which would have been much more experimental, drawing from fiction and kind of, let's say, being admitting that it was film and it was constructed, it was artifice in a way, and yet drawing from real life, right? And
Hmm.
creating those stories out of real life. So in a way, like, where is she, right? Is she? And I think this is the funny thing about Strand, and why she actually hasn't gotten maybe the notoriety she deserves,
Hmm.
particularly in film scholarship. It's like you don't know quite where she belongs, right? Her commitments aren't as obvious. She's drawing from the everyday. Lots of her film or her shooting is observational, right? She's
Hmm.
not intervening. She's staging some shots, obviously, but she also does a lot of just observational work.
Hmm.
So, I would say that, what I love about her is that, like, she's not dogmatic about where she belongs or who she belongs to or her school of filmmaking, let's say. She's intuitive. Think of her as a really intuitive filmmaker. She's
Right.
like, this is the way this is the way I feel, the form this story deserves. And you can see the two forms are very different also. Her range is really wide.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that seems like a really good point. I mean, something that I, in sort of researching this, read was that in many cases she resisted the interpretation of her films or resisted sort of, yeah, like very specific ways of reading meaning into the films as opposed to the appeal to intuition, which is funny because that's the sort of thing that we generally tell students not to do in
Yeah.
film school or in art school, is not to be intuitive, but to have, sort of like concrete reasons. But she's part of that strand of it's funny, that group of
No
filmmakers
pun
who,
intended.
yeah, exactly, who, yeah, they definitely appealed to the intuition, to the unconscious. And I don't know, there's something interesting you said there about how she was received at the time that she was making these films, and it's interesting to think back to that. I mean, when I first saw these films, I saw them out of context. There was a presentation to try to give some context, but I only had so much awareness of what the world of film was at that time, and in reading again about Strand and how her films were received, she was making these films in a moment where uh, the environment of maybe feminist filmmaking was very different than what she was doing, which was, I think she was drawing much more on a kind of beat sensibility. Um, uh, and the experimental film world had moved to a different kind of place as well that was much more about the structural and,
Hmm.
critiquing the apparatus of the filmmaking process and that sort of thing. So I don't know. Maybe another question is, yeah, where did she fit into that paradigm of feminist film?
And it's taken a while. I think it was, maybe in the 1990s, where she was really, I think, identified by feminist film scholars as someone who, well, hey, it turns out she was really devoted to telling women's stories. And many of her
Hmm.
films are really about foregrounding women's stories, like in soft fiction, right? And in this case, female sexuality and sensuality, I think she's interested in, and how complicated it is in this world that women live in, right, which is the world of patriarchy. So for her, and that film is all about heterosexual relationships, and it's about
Hmm.
grandfathers and fathers. And so that, those parts of it, I feel like those talking head parts, personal experience, would have fit really well into films from feminist filmmakers, documentary films from feminist filmmakers that had started in the late 60s and moved throughout the 1970s. That fits. But the moment when she moves, there's so many moments where you're like, where did she go, or where is she, or she just, so many other things catch her eye and catch
Hmm.
her, and she wants to juxtapose, right, those moments of like intense kind of like personal political narrative with like light and shadow,
Hmm.
and sort of just the intrigue of the art of cinema, and those moments give you pause, and they give you time to kind of reflect and ingest and think, and they aren't, and they also aren't delivered with the same kind of, let's say, sort of manifesto quality of maybe some of the other feminist films at the time, right? Some of these
Right.
stories, you think like, is that a story, is that a story to celebrate, I mean, or not, that seems complicated. Is this what we mean by advocating for, let's say, space and time for female sexuality? Like, is that what I meant, and I love
Right.
that about, it's so destabilizing. You're like, yes, but also what, and so that, I think, wouldn't have, I think there would have been probably some reserve about foregrounding those kinds of stories in that way. I think
Right.
she until later, until maybe, I would say, like I said, like 90s and later, when people maybe started to get more interested in her ethnographic work and her cross-cultural work,
Hmm.
right,
Hmm.
which I think then became more prominent. So,
Right.
but still, you'll see there's, there are essays about her and in women's experimental cinema books. There are essays about her, sort of scattered throughout scholarship, but there isn't like a clear, she evades, categorization in a
Right.
really,
Right.
and I think partly because what you said, because of how she mixes, she's at the interstices, we would say, like many of these categories.
Right. 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 Yeah, and that's a tough place to be in a lot of ways. I mean, I think we strive for that lack of categorization so often, but yeah, it does create this difficulty in figuring out how to be categorized. We have an interesting question here in the chat by Evan. Do we know of the relationship between Chick Strand and Les Blank? It seems like in regards to the marriage of ethnography and intuitive filmmaking, they have a lot in common. That's something I don't feel as ready to answer. Shilyh, do you feel like you have some
I
information on that?
mean, only so, insofar as like, here was the world of Canyon cinema, like
Right.
here, here, this was the world. This is the world she loved. I love to read her interviews with her because, as Michael and I have already talked about, she doesn't like to be pinned down. And if any question an interviewer asks her, she tends to kind of like slip away from. And so the question of influence, for example, is a question that she's like, I don't know. It was the World War II. It was the Beats. It was the hippies. It was just like there was the zeitgeist. What can I say? It was everywhere.
Yeah.
And all I knew was I just loved making films, and I just couldn't stop. And so those tend to be her answers about questions like that. And but I do think, I mean, Michael, I think you know more about this than I do. Sort of the Bay Area, I think, was just like fertile with
Hmm.
these
Hmm.
interrelations and these screenings and people just really collaborating artistically in a number of ways.
Absolutely, and a very different scene than say the East Coast, where cinema societies like Amos Vogel's Cinema 16 or the other kinds of things Jonas Mekas was doing, which, I mean, we're connected to the counterculture, but yeah, the Bay Area had and continues to have a very special kind of relationship to anti sort of institutional or, sort of like informal approaches to film and things that are based in collectives. I mean, it's very it demonstrates a lot that Canyon Cinema, for a great deal of its life, was a cooperative that was sort of cooperatively owned. So that, I think that speaks to the kind of anarchistic kind of attitude. And the Bay Area, yeah, is amazing. I mean, I don't feel totally qualified to speak about it, but it's just an amazing place where experimental film is just part of the fabric of the culture that's bubbling underneath the surface of what is now mostly Google, I guess. But yeah.
She would have been, I think, one of the few women in that world, actually. I mean, I know there were a couple more, right? But, it's interesting that that was her home as opposed to, I mean, there were also, Newsreel had a women's collective out, in the Bay Area as well. It's interesting that that was her artistic home, right? Among which was generally a lot of male, independent and experimental filmmakers at the time.
Right.
And, I don't know what to make of it exactly, except to say that I think I would say that her commitments, like if we had a spectrum between like really political and wanting to kind of change the world social justice wise, and then really aesthetic and wanting to change the world consciousness wise through art and through experimental, she leans more towards, right? She leans more towards kind of emphasizing the aesthetic practice as the way to really make change in the world and change maybe, the path towards the future, as opposed to kind of like, demonstrations and claims and whatnot. So I think that's maybe why that was her home in a way. She was also an artist. I mean, she was a trained painter, right? I mean, she continued to paint and do photography, so I think she really thought of herself above all as kind of, an artist who was interested in the human experience.
Right, exactly. I wonder if if it makes sense to talk about ethnography more broadly, because that is a topic that's explored so much in contemporary experimental and documentary film, and that cool interstice between. And it's much easier for me to see influences that come from Chick Strand into the present than it is for me to necessarily see precedents to her. Someone like Naomi Uman, I feel like, whose films I admire a lot, definitely, has a relation to this work. Ben Rivers, Ben Russell, Fern Silva, some of these filmmakers also seem to be very influenced by these films that were done in Central and South America in particular. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, how does that relate to how ethnography is understood now? Are there developments that maybe look back at this a certain way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really, I think, here's where I think her relevance has really reasserted itself, in our kind of more post-colonial environment, an environment which we're challenging kind of let's say the legacies of white supremacy, and colonial sort of thinking and worldview here. When she would have been making this, her films, or when she would have been in, let's say, in graduate school in anthropology in California in the late 60s, she went in 66. And so I can imagine what that was like. I mean, that would have been the days of Robert Gardner's Dead Birds, and that would have been kind of like the litmus ethnographic film for the period. It was beautiful. It was artistic, quote unquote, but it was highly problematic in terms of the way that the other, was represented, right? There's the white male patriarchal narrative over the whole film. We never hear from the indigenous subjects in their own language. We have, we're told what they're thinking. We're told what they're doing. I think that's the world she would have come into. And I think she, and it's clear that that was not satisfying to her, that didn't give you what she called that sort of true document. And I think she felt like, that her job was, to challenge, and that would have been the legacy, right, from Robert Flaherty's Nanook of the North all the way through to Robert Gardner. That would have been what there was. very few challenges to that form before the 1960s. And then, we celebrate people like, D'Antonioni and his challenges to maybe that form of cinema, but we celebrate Les Chick Strand and the way that she, from the beginning, was dissatisfied with that idea. And so here we go in COSAS and VIDA, we have this film about a really traditional ethnographic subject. We have an indigenous, musician, that's a traditional ethnographic subject, someone who's very different from her, at the bottom of the ladder, sort of culturally, from her perspective. And yet she, devotes this gorgeous film to him, and allows him to, quote unquote, tell his own story, which was the kind of flip that ethnography took, like, let's say after the 1970s, right? Which is like, and yet, she makes him tell his story in English, which is just such a weird and fascinating choice on her part. And in a way, I think also really smart, really smart, because she says to herself, who's going to watch this film? English speaker, who's going to watch this film?
Right.
What is translation? What does it mean to translate his words, and then allow him to read them, not in his own language. I mean, I'm not sure how to even wrap my head around like what this choice really means, but I know it's like unheard of, right? I mean, I don't think I've seen anything like it. And she doesn't do it in all of her films. So it's, it's just, I think the way that she's working out that dynamic, the power dynamic between the power she has to film him and tell his story and the power he has to tell his story, but in a way that doesn't really give him away. He doesn't tell it in his own language. He reserves his, let's say, the authenticity of himself in his own language. He reserves that. We don't get access to that. Right. We get access to this other thing, which is like the already translated thing, which seems fair. I'm like, why should he let me into like his true, essential, authentic self? Who am I? What do I deserve?
For sure. Well, I mean, it gets even more complicated if you think he probably wrote that in Spanish, but his language is this indigenous language that, he mentions at the beginning of the film. He didn't even speak Spanish at a certain stage. So
good point. So what would it mean if it were in Spanish? It wouldn't be authentic either. And then if it were in his indigenous language, she wouldn't be able to understand it. And there so you can see the complexity that she's really trying to work through. And also maybe it isn't a perfect solution, but it puts the problem on display.
Right.
And that's powerful.
Interesting. That film, I think, is from 1976, but I think she had been shooting it for something like 10 years before she actually edited it. But it's interesting watching it after soft fiction, where soft fiction almost feels like a rehearsal of different methods of allowing people to tell their own stories, but she picks almost a different method for every speaker, one telling in voiceover over another scene, one who's written a letter that someone else is reading, and then some directly addressing the camera. So it's, I don't know, you almost see her experimenting with different forms of the subjectivity of the subject in a way.
That's right. Yeah. And how to make that subject, sort of present to us, through the medium of cinema, which is already a translation, right, of the real. I think I think I love that way of thinking about it, Michael. I really think that she knows that there's no single answer to this problem, and that her responsibility, I think, as an artist is to, as I said, sort of put the problem on display and then give us, a range of responses to it, depending on the subject and the story they're telling. That, for example, the story that I found so jarring when I rewatched this film, the story, of this woman recounting her childhood experiences with her grandfather. On the other hand, we have this woman in the kitchen. She's powerful, she's strong, she's so comfortable in her body that she's cooking, naked. I mean, there's a certain kind of courage there already. But then to also, to put that on film, and this, that juxtaposition is, is both kind of troubling, but also, I think, a way to grant her subject authority and like the integrity of surviving, what it means not just to have had that experience, but to have survived it, and what kind of woman she became after. I mean, I don't know if it's the same woman on the horse later, but it might be. And I think, like, that story did not define her, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think she's very sensitive about where and when and how to tell
Hmm.
those stories.
That's
Yes.
fantastic. Okay, we've got another question from the chat. I was wondering if there's a progression in soft fiction from detachment, distance, not even sure whose story the woman is reading, to more and more attached and emotional. Um, that's an interesting observation. I'm not exactly sure which way that progression moves. Um, I would have to go back and kind of like analyze each of those in order. Um, so I'm not exactly sure, but there definitely is a kind of oscillation in how much each subject sort of bears themselves to the camera, I think. Um, yeah.
And where the camera is in relation to them, right? I mean, when I think of Strand's work in general, I think of this like almost overbearing closeness,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Sometimes the closeness feels too close. She's apparently she would shoot in very short range with a telephoto lens, right? So she had this
Hmm.
way of creating this sort of distance closeness even within her own style of filmmaking. And I think, rather than maybe perhaps a progression, I might say that this is, it's like a dialectic, to use a kind
Hmm.
of jargony word, or kind of like a, it's a constant kind of flux. She's sort of, playing with that. And that to me is a very ethnographic question,
Right.
right? It's a very,
Yeah.
the question of like, of becoming close and intimate, and want to tell somebody's kind of personal story that is so different from your own, and knowing that you will always remain at a distance from it. Like, you can only ever
Hmm.
get so close. The
Right.
camera can get close, but subjectively, your ability to really, as we say, sort of inhabit somebody else, know someone else's experience well, walk in their shoes, we might say,
Hmm.
that is kind of a, that's a really, sort of impossible ideal.
Hmm. That's an interesting point. The camera work really occurred to me watching these two films again and thinking of that other film, Fake Fruit Factory, which also is told pretty much exclusively in extreme close-up. And it occurred to me, I wish we could ask her about this. It's probably written somewhere, and maybe you read it in researching, but it occurs to me that what she might be doing there is denying context, and staying in a subjective mode by keeping the camera so close to the subject, rather than building an entire world around them that's an interpretation of them. She's staying close to the subject instead. That may not be exactly what she was intending, but that's one effect that I find myself having. Okay, so I think we've got one more question. Story about photographing the cowboys and the way she was reading it was very strange, and I had trouble grasping the tone. What was your reading of it? Maybe I'll extend that to you, Shilyh.
Yeah, same. I mean, I think there's not a lot of certainty about whose letter that is, whether that's kind of a stage third person reading or not. From what I've researched, the woman reading the letter is a handwriting expert, and so
Hmm.
so you see her kind of with her magnifying glass studying the letter, and she's commenting a lot about the shape of the letters and the
Oh, interesting.
handwriting and whatnot. So it could be that in that particular case. Some, distance was wanted, as you said. So this is another way, sort of the third person way of telling this story through a kind of like expert, but, but whose expertise are not actually being called upon really
Hmm.
for the film. That story to me, I think, is one of those moments in the film where you're like, pre-Me Too, right? That's like a very
Hmm.
pre-Me Too story, actually even kind of 70s feminism, story. Because the woman is not really clear. Does she want to? Consent is like at issue here. We're not really sure whether any of these stuff. But the letter reader, right, frames that story for us as a story of like autonomous, sensuality and sexuality. Like the woman, sort of like couldn't believe what was happening to her, but in the end was kind of like, that was wild, like
Hmm.
here. And there isn't a lot of trauma or sadness or confusion or anger in that story. And I think, and isn't, I mean, it seems also so true and about sexuality in general, which is like how complicated and
Yeah.
strange, and in the moment one thing, and then later another, and then telling the story another. And I think, it's troubling to listen to. I had trouble listening to it because I wanted kind of like a my kind of 21st century feminist self wanted like a this is not a good example of consent kind of moment,
Right.
and you don't get it. You're
Yeah.
like, I don't know. Should I be upset for her? Is she upset? What is she? I don't know. And I think that ambiguity is brave. For a filmmaker in this period, as troubling as it is. So.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Okay, we probably need to get close to wrapping up. If there's another question in the chat, I want to give you guys the opportunity to ask that. But I have maybe one more rabbit hole to go down while the delay is manifesting. You mentioned her making pies and the sort of like costumes, and I think because we're in this sort of weirdo context where we're screening these films in a, maybe we could call this a digital public, or I don't know, a virtual commons or something. I'm not exactly sure, but we're trying to create community by screening these films where we can see them in real time and have a discussion about them and give context. But the context she and Bruce Bailey were showing films in those very early days in the early 60s was very different, very informal, and sounds like just a lot of fun. I wonder if you can describe what you found about that.
One of the things that stood out for me reading about these happenings, right? I mean, I think it comes in that sort of 60s guise of like, be there, feel it, be with other people in this sort of, trancy, ravey, whatever was happening. Is that they knew that they had to lure people in to watch these films. I mean, it's things are not so different, which is, they were, experimental film wasn't, excessively more popular then than it is now. I mean, it was still something you had to kind of convince people, to come be with you, people who weren't, I guess, already practitioners or in the, and so, so in a way that they had to sort of build out the event. And I, so they had, I love this door prizes, they literally, they did them outside, and they, and she would dress up apparently for all of them. And I want to say, I think it was Bruce Conner who was the pie maker.
Oh, that might be right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he would make these pies, and then they would raffle them off, and people would go home with pies that may or may not be like enhanced for her pleasure or whatever, I'm like, there's so much going on. But what I love about it is this note is like, part of it was like wild and crazy 60s, but part of it was like, how do you get people in to these sorts of events?
Right. Yeah, that's great. Hopefully we'll be in a situation where we can share pies and, print programs with our favorite recipes in them again. And maybe there can be semi-legal things going on or something. But for now, we're here. And thank you, Shilyh, for being here with us. Thank you all for, being in the chat with us and for viewing the films. This is, really nice to kind of be able to have something that is a Dallas-specific community online that feels like a familiar space and see familiar names in the chat, but also to have the opportunity to have people from outside of the, outside of the area, the geographical area, and to be able to touch, a few more folks. So thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Shilyh. We will hopefully,
what a pleasure.
We will hopefully have more DEx screenings coming up soon. We delayed a screening of the work of Woody Vasulka because it was meant to take place right as the lockdown was happening. We're working on getting that up and running, and we're also going to have a screening of Jen Proctor's work later in September. So many things kind of coming. I'll maybe give one more plug to Shilyh's book, this Subject to Reality, which we're selling some copies of that Shilyh donated. We will be donating the proceeds to those, so go to info@top10records.org. It's in the chat. It will be in the description. And then also, it's published by University of Illinois Press. You can buy it directly from them also if we run out of copies. Try to avoid using Amazon because fuck Amazon. And yeah, all right. So thanks, Shilyh.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, what a pleasure. Thank you for bringing her back into my orbit and for letting me spend some time on her work and talking to you about them. It's been so fun.
Absolutely. This was a lot of fun. All right. We'll see you soon and see you all soon.
Are we off?